Welcome to the fifth webinar dealing with the Hamas-Israel war. It's conducted and sponsored by the Center for Israel Education here in Atlanta. The center's mission is to educate broadly on all aspects of modern Israel as we engage teens, young adults, educators, and the general public, the media, and curious learners. Our materials are found in Hebrew, Spanish, English, and several other languages. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the center and Emeritus professor at Emory University. The fifth webinar today will track events over the last month, but concentrate on the last week. In these webinars, we've tried to understand, explain, and analyze Hamas's objectives for killing Jews and destroying Israel. We've tried to evaluate Israel's military, civilian, and diplomatic responses, and assessed how Middle Eastern states and states outside of the region have reacted. Over the past week, as Israel continued its military attacks against Hamas, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken was in the region for the fourth time, seeking to tamp down the prospects of a widening conflict. He met with an array of Arab leaders, trying to somehow keep it from expanding, knowing full well that Iran has played a role. To what degree? We will discuss that today, perhaps, in trying to harass and kill Israelis and deny Israel a sense of legitimacy. This week, Hezbollah leader Nasrallah spoke to the conflict, as did Iranian officials, and the United States continued to have its two naval carrier groups and a submarine openly displayed in the Suez Canal to join the American presence trying to detract others from joining this conflict. Media jockeys and publicists have tossed around all sorts of ideas about how long the war would last, what's actually going on, what's the substantive agenda for the day after. Today, we're lucky to be joined by three extraordinary analysts and scholars: Dr. Michael Eisenstadt, an authority on military and strategic matters at the Washington Institute, where he's the Kahn Fellow; Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, a prolific author, scholar of modern Syria and American-Israel relations, and formerly a dean and president of Tel Aviv University; and Professor Asher Susser, a scholar of the modern Middle East, Jordan, and political Islam. Asher, like Itamar, is Emeritus Professor of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. Michael, what in your view was Hamas's intention to accomplish by their October 7th attack? And how does that fit into their overall strategy? And how might it differ from what we knew about Hamas prior to October 7th?
I still think we don't have a full picture of exactly what Hamas was trying to accomplish, or what they had in mind. I think there's been a certain degree of post facto justification by Hamas officials saying that what's happening now is actually part of their game plan. And this definitely is true, to, first of all, place the issue of the Palestinians front and center in the Arab agenda as well as the international agenda. From Hamas's point of view, of course, they're involved in a long-term competition with the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And this was an attempt by them to establish their primacy over the PA, which they kind of frame as taking a collaborationist approach. So I think their main goal in this operation was to seize hostages. I mean, of course, Yahya Sinwar, who heads Hamas in Gaza, was a prisoner for 20 years in Israel. This is an important issue for him. You know, with the Gilad Shalit kidnapping more than 15 years ago, they were able to free over 1,000 prisoners, including Sinwar himself. There were 5,200 Palestinian prisoners at the beginning, around October 7th. So I think they saw this as a way of taking a large number of hostages that they could swap for prisoners, burnish their credentials vis-a-vis the PA, and kill as many Israelis as possible, and therefore demonstrate that the path of resistance and jihad, and not accommodation or collaboration, was the way forward for the Palestinians. And of course, they wanted to disrupt the ongoing normalization efforts between Israel and the Arabs. I don't think they anticipated the Israeli response in terms of going in on the ground. I think they probably figured there would be airstrikes. From their point of view, any Palestinians that are killed in airstrike creates more hatred and bitterness, and therefore feeds their strategy of precluding any kind of peace agreement with Israel. But I think they didn't expect the Israelis to go in on the ground in the way they did, because if you look back in recent decades, Israel, except for maybe Operation Cast Lead, and then in 24, the operation, then they went in a very limited way. It's very clear that Israel has been avoiding major ground operations for several decades now, and therefore they didn't anticipate such a heavy response. As far as Iran's role, there's no evidence, as far as I know, that Iran was involved in the selection of the timing for this particular operation, but there's no doubt that Iran was deeply involved in helping Hamas build up the military capabilities that were necessary in order to launch this operation, and that this operation served Iran's regional strategy, which is to surround Israel with a series of militias armed with rockets, drones, missiles that could plunge Israel into conflict every few months, every few years, so that life eventually becomes intolerable in Israel. And that this contributes in some way to the demoralization of the Jewish community in Israel, and that eventually you have a process by which those who can leave the country will leave it. Investment in Israel dries up, and therefore Israel's long-term viability kind of becomes in question. So again, I don't see detailed cooperation with regard to this particular operation, although I have no doubt that perhaps at least between Hamas and Hezbollah, there was probably significant cooperation in working on the plan, because the template for the plan is exactly what we know Hezbollah has been planning to do in the north for years. Cross-border operations to seize hostages, seize terrain perhaps, and inflict losses on Israel in order to demoralize Israel and strike a blow on Israeli's sense of security. So the template was developed by Hezbollah in the last few years. So perhaps there was some cooperation there in terms of some of the detailed planning. But in terms of the implementation, I take the claims of Hamas officials at face value. That was the Palestinian decision in terms of the timing of the operation.
To follow up just briefly about what Israel's military strategy is now, it doesn't look like it's engaged in a major military invasion. It looks like it's squeezing Hamas without trying to overpower it. And maybe that's because it's the urban area. Yesterday, someone described the underground tunnels as sort of like going to Columbus Circle or DuPont Circle and understanding that there are a whole series of subways that end up at the center. And this center might be described as the subterranean levels of Shifra Hospital, which is in the middle of Gaza. The Israelis, in going after these tunnels, have to have certain kind of strategy. Do you have any inkling about what that strategy might be and how they might go after these tunnels and what the timing might be in terms of the plotting process?
My perception is that Israel has very well-defined war aims, which is to destroy Hamas's military capabilities and its ability to govern in Gaza, as has been stated by both the Israeli government and Israeli senior military officers. But I think they have an operational approach in search of a strategy, if you will, because they don't have, at this point, a concept for how to translate their anticipated military achievements to a sustainable political set of arrangements for the day after. But I think they are very determined, and I see a degree of determination I've not seen in Israel in the course of my entire career, to go in, to do the job right, to do it comprehensively. Now, again, what they want to accomplish will necessitate a long war. We're talking about something that will last for months. The longer the war drags out, the greater the potential for developments that can complicate the achievement of Israel's war aims. But they have to act slowly because, first of all, I think they recognize that their intelligence regarding Gaza was not all that they had hoped it to be. There's a lot of unknowns here. They have to move carefully. There were questions about the capability of the ground forces, which had been under-resourced in recent years in terms of the defense budget and in terms of their performance, perhaps in 2006. They're doing this in a very methodical, deliberate way, but also because of the density of the population in Gaza, you can't go in everywhere at once. Gaza City is the center of gravity. They're focusing on Gaza City now, but in subsequent phases, they will have to eventually turn their attention to the parts of Gaza that are south of Wadi Gaza. And the problem is, after asking all the people to move south, they're going to have to then ask them where they're going to go. This, I think, is one of the challenges that the Israelis will face in subsequent phases of the war. But right now, the focus is on Gaza City, and there's a lot of unknowns there. They said that they've been making more progress than they expected, but that's typical. First of all, let me just say this is typical of urban fights, that when you start off, Very often it starts easy, and as the enemy's lines tighten up, it gets tougher. And it's also possible that the Hamas has decided not to fight back yet in a serious way, waiting for Israel to have kind of extended lines of communication and have its forces deployed throughout Gaza City before then they try to attack throughout the city from their tunnels and the like. We'll see. There's a lot of unknowns here. The strategy is still a work in progress, but the operational concept, I think, is pretty solid, which is basically defeat in detail Hamas, kill as many of its leadership as possible to create a new reality for the day after in the Gaza Strip.
I'd like to call upon Itamar to make whatever comments he wishes about how he sees the American response. How does he see the president's response? Secretary of State Blinken, the last time a Secretary of State came to Israel in the middle of a war was in the 1973 war when Kissinger came and had long chats with Golda. How do you view the relationship in terms of how it has unfolded? And how do you view the American response to Israel's quest for support?
The U.S. response, first and foremost, that of President Biden has been awesome from the very first moments of the crisis when the magnitude of the crisis became apparent. Also, the fact that in the first couple of days, the Israeli system, including the IDF, seemed to be off balance. And the president personally and the United States played a very important role in consolidating the Israeli position, helping Israel to come back to itself. Then with massive support in terms of resupply, political diplomatic support, the president's own appearance in Israel, and so forth. And this has been exceptional and very, very much appreciated in Israel. On top of the president's very deep personal commitment to Israel, he and his administration are fully aware of the fact that what they do resonates in a larger circle. They understand very well that the attitude, the orientation of countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, to some extent Jordan, Morocco, their friends in the Middle East, depends on their sense of how reliable and effective the U.S. is as the ally and protector. This is a test case to these relationships. Thirdly, there is a discrepancy between the very warm attitude to Israel and the, I would say, lukewarm relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition. There are very clear and open differences of opinion. There's also, in a way, a clash of interests here. I don't mean the more minor disagreements over issues of humanitarian supply, but the day after. And the day after, I think it is well understood that the Palestinian Authority should be brought back to the Gaza Strip to run it, and that a larger Israeli-Palestinian negotiation should begin. I'm not talking about a two-state solution tomorrow morning. I'm talking about the beginning of a political process in order to enable the Arab countries in the region to participate with Israel, both with regard to the Gaza policy and with regard to the larger confrontation with Iran. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to realize that this is not just a Hamas-Israeli war. It's the first Iranian-Israeli war. Michael Eisenstadt very well described to us how Iran carefully built this ring around Israel. It is very important for Israel to break that ring, and it's very important for the US and its allies that Iran does not appear as a major regional and international power, acting not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, and frighten the Arab states into making concessions and reconciling with Iran. Finally, it's not just the United States. We read a lot about negative media responses. We read a lot about demonstrations. But the fact of the matter is that the G7, headed by the United States, and Secretary Blinken was there, published a statement today on the state of the war. The word ceasefire did not appear there. So Israeli quest for more time to accomplish the job, to get it done. US support for it now has the umbrella, at least of the G7. This is a major international fact of life.
What is Iran's presence in Syria? And how does that confront Israel's national security? And then the second part is Syria at all a player, simply because of its geography, that is of considerable concern or of some concern to Israeli defense of its country.
Syria itself is barely a player. Bashar al-Assad survived the civil war due to Russian and Iranian intervention on his behalf, and he's in control of about 60% of Syria. There is massive foreign presence in Syria, Russian, Iranian, Turkish, American, Shiite militias. It's basically a failed state, one of several in the Arab world. But the geography, as you said, is there. And I think it is part of this Iranian scheme to surround Israel with hostile militias to turn the Golan Heights front, make it active again. So far, not very impressively. But in the future, Iran, in its geopolitical vision for the Middle East, wants to have this land bridge from Iran to the Mediterranean, going through Iraq and Syria itself and Syria, Lebanon. And therefore, they have designs on Syria's territory, and the whole cooperation in Syria between Russia and Iran is now closer because the two also collaborate in Ukraine.
In terms of the regional response, it seems that over the month that's transpired since the war started, Arab state responses have been navigating between domestic political factors, whatever those constraints are, and ideological commitments, and then the voices of the general public. Maybe even managing political Islam in each place. Asher, how has King Abdullah navigated this?
Jordan is very much a product of its geopolitical centrality, which is sometimes very challenging to Jordan, but also a regional strategic asset where countries invest in Jordan's security precisely because of its geopolitical centrality. So Jordan is deeply affected by this conflict. And as a result, I would say the mixed message that King Abdullah is putting out. On the one hand, there is obviously the Palestinian public in Jordan and Jordan public opinion generally that sees the images on television day in and day out, and of course condemns Israel for its attack in Gaza, and Jordan must respond by showing its sympathy and support for the Palestinian war effort, which it has done by withdrawing its ambassador, by not allowing the Israeli ambassador to return, by establishing a field hospital in Gaza, and similar acts of sympathy with the Palestinian struggle. But behind the scenes, Jordan would like to see Hamas beaten and defeated very decisively. I would say the same is true of Egypt and of Saudi Arabia and a few others, who in their heart of hearts would like to see Hamas defeated and see Hamas as a threat to themselves. So Jordan is in, I would say, a mixed mind on this issue, and on the one hand does take action against Israel, but nothing very extreme. The withdrawal of the ambassador is something that Jordan has done in previous crises, and therefore is nothing really new in terms of relating to Israeli-Palestinian tensions. But from there, I would like to point to some other regional responses. And here, point to what I think must be a serious Hamas disappointment. First of all, we spoke earlier about what the Hamas objectives were. And I think Hamas must have been quite stunned by the extent of its success. I doubt whether Hamas went to war on the 7th of October expecting to achieve the unbelievable subversion of the Israeli sense of security that they did achieve, and therefore drawing upon Gaza the kind of military response that it has drawn, far more ferocious than Hamas has ever experienced, far more than I think that they expected. But in these circumstances, the Arab response has been disappointing. It's all very well to have Al Jazeera on your side, to have some demonstrations of sympathizers in Western capitals. In some cases, the demonstrations in Western capitals were greater than they were in Arab capitals. But the Arab response, if it be the West Bank, if it be Hezbollah, if it be the other Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq, even the Houthis have participated, but rather limitedly. The extent of Arab support, I think, has been very disappointing for Hamas, and I think a setback. And much has come out recently in the media precisely about this disappointment from the Hamas point of view. The war with Hezbollah is tying down a large contingent of Israeli troops on the border with Lebanon, but both Israel and Hezbollah are managing the confrontation on the border there very cautiously, not to have it degenerate into all-out war. What is now being said about the day after is not exactly Hamas's recipe either. All those who are speaking about the day after and creating a post-war reality in Gaza are talking about a post-war reality in Gaza that doesn't include Hamas. Hardly their pre-planned objective. Can it be achieved? This day after idea of bringing the Palestinian Authority back? For that, I would say, and conclude with this comment about the fate of political Islam in different countries and different places. Hamas has been amazingly successful in the Palestinian political arena, far more successful than Muslim Brethren movements in Arab countries like Egypt or Jordan or other countries, even in Tunisia. And the question is why? Why has Hamas been so successful in the West Bank and Gaza, winning the elections in 2006, and very much on top of things in Gaza since 2007, which the Muslim Brethren haven't succeeded in doing elsewhere? And the reason is the weakness of Palestinian central government. In Egypt and Jordan, you have very powerful central governments that do not allow the Muslim Brethren, and certainly not Hamas, in Jordan, for example, to operate or to operate successfully. And the regime in Jordan in recent years has badgered the Muslim Brethren, beaten them into the ground, more or less, though they are still very popular in the public eye. For the post-war reality to work, there has to be a power center created in Gaza, powerful enough to keep Hamas out. For that, you need a well-organized Palestinian Authority, which we don't have yet. And to have a well-organized Palestinian Authority, you need a peace process, as Itamar was talking about before. The weakness of the Palestinian Authority is because of the degrading of Oslo. The Palestinian Authority was a product of Oslo. Its justification was the implementation of Oslo. The undoing of Oslo essentially is the undoing of the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. So we must have a revived Palestinian-Israeli peace process to get the PA back on board with a sense of Palestinian legitimacy, for it to be brought back into Gaza as a legitimate force in the Palestinian political order. That would also require assistance from some key Arab states, Egypt particularly, but Jordan too. And the question is, to what extent would countries like these be willing to play a part in the reconstruction of Palestinian Authority in Gaza?
It seems that Hezbollah's Nasrallah, their leader, is walking a balance. I don't want to say he's risk averse, but it seems to engage in a full-scale conflict with Israel might result in a result that neither he nor his Iranian supporters might want. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, from his point of view, this is not his fight, even though this is something which he wants to encourage and support. This gets to a bigger dilemma that Iran faces in terms of regional strategy. And let me just say, in dealing with Iran and Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah was created as Iran's foremost proxy and its most successful proxy creation, it's more a partnership than a proxy relationship in many ways, in that Iran is often deferential to Nasrallah's priorities and concerns, in part because Hezbollah has become too important to fail for Iran. Because Iran needs Hezbollah to deal with the big one, so to speak. God forbid, a conflict in the future that either involves Israel and Iran or the United States and Iran, and that he'll need Hezbollah to keep its powder dry in order to use its rocket and missile force in order to either deter the possibility of an attack on Iran or to respond. But the dilemma it faces, and what it's been trying to do in recent years, is to create proxies for its proxy as a result. Hamas is not a proxy of Tehran. They are a partner, and there's been tensions in the relationship in the past. But Hamas plays this role of the expendable partner. Likewise, they've been trying to create proxies for Hezbollah in Iraq and in Syria that could, as Itamar mentioned, kind of activate the Golan Front again. Now, Israel, through its campaign between the wars, has really thwarted these efforts to create an active front in the Golan or in Syria. And by this operation against Hamas in Gaza, they might further preclude Gaza's emergence as a hot front in the future. And Iran doesn't want to have to rely exclusively on Hezbollah as part of its strategy against Israel. So this has the potential to provide a major setback against Iran's regional strategy. Now, of course, there are those in Israel and the United States who have argued that Iran doesn't pay a price for acting as arsonists in the region, that if you keep cutting off and I hate these animal analogies, octopus or cat's paws and all this stuff, but if you keep attacking its proxies, it pays no price because these are all expendable from its point of view, and it will continue to find other proxies. So that's a valid point. But if you can, through kind of activities related to the campaign between the war in Syria, prevent the emergence of an active front there, if through the Israeli military activities in Gaza now, you can destroy Hamas, that really will greatly limit Iran's options vis-a-vis Israel, because they don't want to have to rely on Hezbollah as this whole active front, because again, Hezbollah is too important to be squandered in a fight that doesn't involve core Iranian interests. So that's the dilemma they face. And again, Nasrallah has a similar calculus in that he's the strongest party in Lebanon, but their position is precarious, both in terms of their internal following. There are those who are disappointed by his speech last week for not being more proactive. And I think there are others who were perhaps glad that after several years of fighting in Syria, Hezbollah perhaps was not on the brink of another war. And certainly in terms of Hezbollah standing in Lebanon, many Lebanese don't want Hezbollah to gamble away the future of the country, which is already precarious. So they have a lot of dilemmas. So right now, what they're doing is trying to kind of thread the needle through limited military activities is a preferred outcome, because it enables them to posture, engage in performative resistance, as I call it, without risking war. But there's always a chance for miscalculation. And Nasrallah did say all options are on the table, and potentially if Hamas is on the verge of being destroyed, they might escalate. But then by then it might be too late, so maybe they don't.
Michael analyzed the intricate relationship between Iran and its investment in Hezbollah, using it as a deterrent against either American or Israeli attack on its nuclear installations. I think one of the restraining considerations for Iran in these recent weeks has been the presence in the region of a massive American force. And the thought, I think, might have occurred to them that if Hezbollah launches a full-fledged war against Israel, the deterrent would have been used on that, and it would have been an opportunity for the United States and or Israel together to destroy their nuclear infrastructure. I think the thought must have occurred to them and must have been acted as a deterrent.
There's always the danger that this kind of careful balance between Israel and Hezbollah on the border can also include some miscalculations that will lead to an escalation that nobody really wants. But there is a thought in Israel which has now become very public, and that is the abandoning of Israeli towns and kibbutzim along the border with Lebanon, which will become a permanent feature of Israeli society unless Hezbollah is moved from the border with Israel. The people who lived on the border there are now saying very openly that they have no intention of going back to their villages and towns unless the reality along the border is one where Hezbollah is moved back even beyond the Litani maybe, but moved away from the border area. Otherwise, they will feel unsafe to live there. And that leaves something dangling in the air about Israel and Hezbollah even after the war with Hamas is over. And that still hovers over the reality that we're talking about without any clear decision at the moment.
Asher, in your response about the weakness of the PA and that they really didn't take the responsibility that was put on their shoulders after 1993, and it continued to be an autocracy, a kleptocracy, highly inefficient. If in fact the PA cannot be placed or transferred or become engaged in the administration of Gaza after the fighting or the war slows down, what happens in the interim? Is it the international community? Is it a trusteeship? Is it a group of people that come together and say, we'll manage this for X number of weeks, months, years to deliver the goods and services that are needed for the population?
I'll say with all due modesty that this is a large helping of guesswork here. I would say one thing about the PA. The weakness of the PA was not only because of its moral ineptitude. The weakening of the PA was to a large degree a function of the failure of the Oslo process, which turned the PA into an appendage of the Israeli security establishment, rather than turning the PA into the vehicle of Palestinian independence and sovereignty, and therefore undermined the legitimacy of the PA in the eyes of the Palestinians and gave Hamas a great deal of credit, which Hamas is building on now even further. So the strength of the PA is very much connected to the reality of the peace process. Is the peace process something really working? Is it getting the Palestinians further towards statehood? And this is where the Israeli government has to do a 180-degree switch. Or alternatively, there has to be a different Israeli government. And I think that in the initial phase of whatever ends up in Gaza when the war is more or less over, Israel may very well have to play the role of filling in for the PA until it is in a position to come in with Jordanian, Egyptian, and perhaps Saudi assistance to take over. It's a very difficult operation, but I don't see anyone other than the PA that is a candidate to do so. But the PA is wedded to the two-state solution. And as Itamar said, nobody expects the two-state solution to be instituted tomorrow morning. But we have to have a process that seems to be leading in that direction, somewhere along that line, towards such an eventuality, which will give the Palestinians a sense of a future, something more hopeful than what they have at the moment in store for them further down the road. And that requires, of course, a huge American input, but it also requires a very significant change in Israeli policy, no question about that.
Why do you suppose there was a measure of tolerance on the part of some Israeli governments to kick the can down the road, to play at times the West Bank off against the Gaza Strip? Was it an unwillingness to come to grips with knowing that you have to come to a final decision on what the territories will be in relation to Israel's borders? How does that mindset change in the governing structure of the state of Israel?
It would require a dramatic domestic change within this government itself, or alternatively, a different government in Israel. What has been done over the last decade or so? It was essentially, you called it kicking the can down the road. It was a way of saying that we have conjured up a mechanism to avoid seriously negotiating the Palestinian issue. And that is to weaken the PA in the West Bank by enhancing Hamas in Gaza, what they called the policy of division or separation between Gaza and the West Bank. There's no united Palestinian leadership, therefore there is no one really to talk to. And not only that, Netanyahu had this philosophy, reinforced, I would say, entirely artificially by the Abraham Accords. The left was always wrong to argue that one has to advance on Palestine in order to make peace with the Arab states, but Netanyahu said it's quite the reverse. One can make peace with the Arab states without the Palestinians having a say, and that was the Abraham Accords, and that was supposed to be the normalization with Saudi Arabia, by marginalizing the Palestinians instead of including them. That, I think, was a major mistake of Israeli policymakers, which has been true for all of Netanyahu's years in government, and I think it is largely responsible for the dead end where we arrived at on the 7th of October.
Since 2006, there was actually no solution to the problem of Gaza once Hamas took it over. Because what we see now is what Israeli governments had been afraid to do since 2006. Namely, if you just responded with a limited military campaign to Hamas, let's say, firing rockets at Israel, this was effective for a very short period, and 3-4 years later, at best, there would be another round of fighting. Because we knew very well what the cost of going full scale into Gaza would be. Number one, a lot of Israeli military casualties. Number two, huge damage to the population and to the infrastructure of Gaza. And finally, what do you do on the day after? The last thing Israel wanted was to, again, be in control of Gaza. So it seemed to be a problem without a solution. And then a temporary relief was offered by the Qataris, who brought in these full suitcases with money to buy peace and quiet, which the Netanyahu government went along with, until, of course, this policy exploded in our face on October 7. It's been a reality check, and we are back to where we should have been much earlier.
In comparison to 50 years ago, or maybe 75 years ago, There used to be something called cabinet collective responsibility that was implemented by Israeli governments. People didn't just run around opening their mouth every 5 seconds and saying some of the most ridiculous things in the world. Is it possible to restore a semblance of community in the political system so you don't have all of these disparate voices speaking out all the time? It seems to me that's also part of the problem, particularly in a social media world, in a media world that picks everything up within seconds. It seems to me political behavior needs to be repaired. And I don't know how you do that from the outside, except maybe doing a seminar in a classroom.
Let me distinguish between two aspects of the same problem. Number one is that the cabinet, the coalition that Netanyahu put together almost a year ago, was far right, far out government with elements in the margins. From the margins of Israeli life and politics were made cabinet ministers. Now, some of them said walking jokes, like the gentleman who made the comment about the nuclear weapons and so forth, and there are others. But there are some of them who need to be taken very seriously. This is the messianic element that thinks they have a divine mission to establish the kingdom or the land of Israel all the way from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, be it in the West Bank or be it in Gaza. And they are dead serious. They're very dangerous. And for me, a change of government in Israel is the most important change that we need to see in the near future.
I just wanted to add the one thing in that respect, and that is the war has exposed two very different aspects of Israeli society. On the one hand, the rather ineffective, if not to say feebleness, of the Israeli government itself. But on the other hand, the amazing mobilized spirit of the Israeli people, which has come to the fore in a way that we haven't seen for decades. And I think adding on to what Itamar said about a different government that has to be energized by the spirit of the Israeli people as expressed in the present crisis. People talk about Israel as a startup nation. Well, I heard someone talking about a restart nation when this is all over. And that, I think, is what we could hope for, to create a better Israel in the respects that presently characterize the government, which has to change. It cannot continue after this horrendous crisis. And like Golda and Dayan had to go after 1973, all the more so Netanyahu and this far-right government.
And what replaces it that has more measure of sanity to its outlook and to grabbing hold of the reality that these two peoples need to separate each other, however that happens. In other words, just replacing the Netanyahu government is not sufficient. You need ideas that can be implemented that are realistic and acceptable to the Israeli public. Is that fair?
I think it's fair,
It's
and I
fair.
think the ideas also exist. Yeah.
That's fair. But, Asher spoke about the civil society, its mobilization, very impressive. Also, not just the protest movement, whatever your politics is, protest movement was a very, very impressive rallying of the civil society against the government hooked on some so-called judicial reform, stop it, and then converted itself into a substitute government once the crisis happened. I was hoping, I haven't seen it yet, that it will also produce a new generation of Israeli political leaders, because the need to see in the ranks of the Israeli opposition the kind of leadership stature that would be able to bring us not, as you said, sort of a mechanical change of government, but a substantive change of government with new and inspired ideas to deal with a very complex reality.
Asher and Itamar put out very well the challenges that Israel faces in terms of creating a framework for Gaza that is sustainable on the day after. I just like to talk about the psychological and ideological environment. We've seen that military traumas and defeats can lead to the discrediting of an ideology or a group's brand. So after the 1967 war, Pan-Arabism was discredited as an ideology, although it led to the rise of Palestinian nationalism. The Israeli response to the Second Intifada in Operation Defensive Shield was a trauma for the West Bankers. And as a result, the doctrine of armed struggle was discredited, at least for a generation. And now we're seeing a new generation coming to age, which doesn't have that memory and are once again attracted to the idea of armed struggle. And we saw also the destruction of ISIS's physical caliphate has greatly diminished the brand of ISIS. And we don't see people conducting attacks around the world in the name of ISIS in large numbers. It still happens in very small numbers. So we could hope that perhaps this trauma in Gaza, which again, nobody should wish for, and the images are horrible. And you were seeing images today of internally displaced people moving from North Gaza to South Gaza, which kind of bring back memories of the Nakba. And hopefully this will discredit Hamas's doctrine of jihad, martyrdom, and resistance, which will have been shown, I hope, to be an unmitigated disaster for the Palestinians, just as this doctrine has produced disaster for those who flocked to ISIS, those who supported Hezbollah. Wherever this doctrine takes root, it produces destruction and disaster. I will also just make one other point, that in the Middle East, the fruits of military victory are often ephemeral, and they're very often undone within a number of years by the social and political forces that they set loose. So the 67 victory for Israel led to a rise of the Palestinian national movement and the Fedayeen organizations. This, in a way, led to, indirectly, the Jordanian civil war, and then several years later to the Lebanese civil war, and then the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in '82, which led to the explosion of the PLO. But the Israeli invasion helped spawn Hezbollah, and that led to an 18-year guerrilla war against Israel. Israel withdrew in 2000. And the perception that Hezbollah had a formula for victory helped contribute to the Palestinian Intifada in 2000. It led Hamas to believe that this was maybe a formula for getting Israel out of Gaza. Israel got out of Gaza in 2005. And that led to a series of wars, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2023. So the defeat of Hamas could create a window of opportunity for diplomacy, but it needs to be seized, because we see in the region very often one conflict leads to another one, and so is the seed of future conflicts. So there needs to be a political process that prevents that from happening. Self-conscious efforts have to be taken to build on what we hope will be Hamas's defeat, to discredit this destructive ideology, which is not only harmful to Israelis, but to Palestinians as well.
Michael, that's a wonderful summation. We're the better for benefiting from the scholarship of the three of you over a lifetime. The Center for Israel Education will next week on Wednesday at noon again have a webinar where we'll discuss other dimensions of the Hamas-Israel war. We ask you to join us then. If you like what you saw and you like what you heard and you'd like to support what we do, just go to our website and do what you think is necessary.